Welcome to the Oral History Project, which Maria Lekic and I have been working on for about a year in an attempt to document the contributions of our most senior and important faculty people. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Paul Wachtel, whom everybody knows, so I'm not going to give you his CV, but hopefully give you a chance to get to know a bit more about him as a person and his journey to where he is today. Yep. So Paul, thank you for schlepping over, and let's just start at the beginning. How'd you get interested in psychology?
Well, it's an odd story in a way. When I was an undergraduate, I was a physics major.
Really?
And I was a physics major because in high school, the only courses where I had to think at all were math and science courses. I had very poor teachers in history and English and so on.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the Bronx.
Okay.
I went to Bronx Science, which was supposed to be a good school.
Yeah, one would say.
But basically, my experience was when I got to college, I had this revelation that you can actually think in words. It's sort of all through high school, it didn't seem that way, only numbers.
Right.
But I had started out as a physics major. I thought I was interested in it. I had a couple of disillusioning experiences because I was at Columbia at a time when they had a lot of Nobel Prize winners in their physics department. So I took, as an undergraduate, several courses with Nobel Prize winners.
That's cool.
And it wasn't cool, unfortunately. I mean, in the sense that they were, first of all, they weren't, well, one was a good teacher, one was a terrible teacher. But I did not have a sense of, this is the person I want to be when I grow up. I was not identifying, and I was sort of excited about all the other stuff that was in this cornucopia that I was being introduced to that was outside my education almost. You know, it just was clear fairly early that that really wasn't what I wanted, that it was sort of from default. But I didn't know what I did want. And I came from a family where there weren't resources to draw on to think about a wider world. It was, my father had a 9th grade education, and I would still somehow go to him with questions, but he didn't really have the answers. But whatever field I was thinking of shifting to, he knew a failure in that field. And goodness. So he was kind of,
kind of like, don't go do
there,
that stage
right.
Because you'll...
Right.
So was there ever a question about you're going to college at all?
Well, I was very lucky. I won a National Merit Scholarship, which paid everything.
Okay, but that's not luck. Come on.
I felt lucky.
Yeah, but you were smart, is what you were.
And it paid everything. Otherwise, I would have gone to City College and probably gotten just as good an education. I say as somebody now teaching there, at City, so it's a City College chauvinist. Right. Though I have certainly good feelings about Columbia and Yale, where I went, for my BA and my PhD. But I would have done fine at City, but I had the scholarship, so I was able to go. That was the only reason. But I was, for a long time, sort of feeling trapped in physics, because I didn't have an exit ramp that I could see. And finally, at the end of my junior year, I had what I now, as a psychologist, know was a panic attack. I didn't know what it was, but all I knew was that when I was studying for exams in the spring of my junior year, and I was, I had done nothing but math and physics, and the few humanities courses that I had a little bit of space for, which actually saved my life.
Yeah.
And I started studying for these exams, and you can't fool yourself in physics, because it isn't, you write an essay and it's sort of like approximately, it's not great, but it...
Right, you can't bullshit in physics,
yeah,
right?
You either get the problem or you don't.
Right.
And I knew I had to get out. I didn't know what to do. And I literally went to the college bookstore and wandered around like it was a Ouija board. Like, where would I be drawn? Let me just sort of look. Where were the books that I never had a chance to read, that my education got in the way of my education kind of thing?
Right.
And I found myself standing in front of psychology books. That's literally how it happened. And before that day, and this was the end of my junior year, it had not once occurred to me
that you'd be interested in psychology.
Yeah.
And this was not experimental, I'm imagining.
Right. It was. I was especially drawn to the books that were sort of very close to each other. There must have been maybe Norton had kind of arranged with the bookstore for a shelf. Very close to each other were Sullivan, Horney, and Erickson.
I knew you were going to say Erickson. That's funny.
Yeah. And I was in.
That's...
and sort of never looked back. Suddenly, that I realized this is exactly what I want to do. But it had literally never occurred to me
But before. It wasn't serendipity. I mean, it sounds like serendipity, but it really wasn't serendipity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So you got interested in sort of the field of, what are we going to call that, development and personality and psychopathology, and then you went straight to grad school?
Well, then I had to try to major in psychology. So I went, and the Columbia department at that time was all Skinnerian. In fact, it was so Skinnerian that literally, because you're probably already picking up how naive I was for many, many years of my life.
Yeah.
And when I went to the library to sort of start looking at psychology books, and many of the psychology books had the Dewey Decimal numbers BF, I thought that was from B.F. Skinner. I really thought that.
That's a riot.
And so the courses I was taking were mostly Skinnerian courses.
And this was in what years?
This was 1960-61.
Okay.
It was my what I did. Well, it was the spring of, must have been 1960, in my junior year, and I looked at the books that they were using in psychology. I went to the chairman of the psychology department, and I said, if I know, I haven't taken any of the prerequisites for the courses I would have to take to do a whole major in my senior year. If I study over the summer and you can give me an exam and I could pass the exam, could I then take all psychology courses? And he was pretty confident I couldn't do it, so he said yes. But compared to physics, it was a lark.
Super easy, right?
So that's what I did. I studied psychology over the summer, and it was a lark for me. Not only easy, but I was enjoying it.
Right.
And I think probably because my interests were really, as soon as I thought I'm interested in psychology, it was very clear. Even what I had in mind was psychoanalysis.
Well, at least clinical psychology, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a little. I went to TC Columbia, but a little after you. When I was there, the Columbia psych faculty was totally experimental. Was it the same when you were there?
Yeah. I mean, more than just experimental, they were Skinnerian.
Well, then what's his name? Stan Schachter. Was he there when you were there?
He was not there,
okay.
No. I did, interestingly, I took one course that Well, I think, let me back up in a way, because I'm thinking, it was all Skinnerian, but me, and I was coming in interested in psychoanalysis.
Right.
So in a way, I think some of the roots of my being interested in integrating these different perspectives sort of started there, because I was trying to put together my just emerging psychoanalytic interest, that I had just discovered,
Right.
a couple of weeks before, with what I was learning from the Skinner. And I kept thinking, well, wait a second, these can sort of go together, So that started then. And the one professor I had who was also in some way, he fit with the rest of the department, so he must have had a strong Skinnerian background. But there were two other things about him that really ended up also sort of positioning me to sort of be a little more ready. So he was a man named Ralph Hefferline. And one of the things about him that I learned only decades later, because this did not come up in the course, was in the original book of Gestalt therapy, it was the author, the first book that presented Gestalt therapy in total, had three authors. We think of Fritz Perls as, and he was the main guy, but there were two other authors. One was Paul Goodman, who was a social critic.
Right.
And the other was Ralph Hefferline.
Ah, okay.
I have no idea, to this day, how he fit with that, except that he was interested in the body, and how we express things bodily, which is probably what brought him together with
Right,
Ralph.
that makes sense.
But he was very much just an experimental psychologist. I don't think he was a clinician. But the other thing that he taught in that course of his that I took, and I don't remember what it was called, but it was like the only
empirical.
Yeah. Was Dollard and Miller's book, Personality and Psychotherapy, which was one of the very first integrative efforts. They put together learning theory and psychoanalysis. And it turned out that when I got to graduate school at Yale, John Dollard, they were both at Yale, and John Dollard ended up being my very first psychotherapy supervisor. So it sort of felt like there was some continuity in my life, even though it sort of began with, a short break, so to speak.
I am just sitting here thinking, what must your parents have thought their kid not only interested in psychology, but then in psychoanalysis?
Right. I think it sort of got past their censors a little bit because they didn't even know what it was. And they knew that I would, when I finished, I would be called doctor.
Okay,
that was enough.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay, so this was a straight line. You went high school, college, grad school.
Right.
So you went to Yale. You got your PhD in, was it clinical?
In clinical, yeah.
Okay. And then?
Then my first job was sort of chasing an illusion of sorts.
Yeah.
In that my first job was at Downstate. And I chose Downstate partly because I wanted to get back to New York, but also because while I was at Yale, I had gotten very interested in hypnosis at that point. And I had gotten interested in hypnosis actually in part, as a research method, as a way of, I don't even remember exactly what I had in mind, but I had some ideas about using hypnosis to study defenses.
Well, you get at the unconscious, right?
Yeah, that certainly was a big part of that. Yeah. And one of the people that was a hero for his role in how he used hypnosis was Merton Gill. And Merton Gill was at Downstate at that time.
Okay.
So I thought, oh, all right. I later got to know Merton pretty well because after I left Downstate after a few years, I was at the Research Center for Mental Health at NYU, and Merton was there. And then I was part of the Rappaport-Klein study group, and Merton was part of that. So I got to know Merton, but never met him once during the time I was at Downstate, which was 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
So it was an illusory, but it got me back to New York.
Right.
And in the middle of it, I started part-time and then came full-time to postdoc.
So you started young.
Yeah. I got my PhD at 25.
So
And
did I. Look at that.
Landsman.
Really?
Right.
And only I was interested in merging social psychology with clinical, kind of the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I was downstate for a couple of years, and then got this a kind of a combination fellowship at Postdoc that was somehow, I forget exactly how it was worked out, but I combined it with being some sort of like clinical research fellow at the Research Center for Mental Health at NYU.
Which paid you.
And that, well, but they both paid in some way.
NYU?
Well, those were the days, this was another world when, there were NIMH paid for training of psychologists. And they had postdoctoral ones as well.
Bernie was the director.
Bernie was the director, yeah.
And what was it like in those years?
Well, I loved it. I think what was really exciting about it for me was that when I trained, it was before the tracks. And
I did not know there was a before the tracks.
Yeah, there was a before the tracks.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, so
So
tell
I
me
actually
about that.
saw the tracks. I saw the cracks in the ice, making it all separate continents. But it was not that they were all friendly. The Freudians and the interpersonalists didn't get along so well.
It was like the Tom Lehrer song, right?
Right, exactly. But it gave me the chance to take courses with and be supervised by people of very different points of view without any feeling I was betraying anybody by doing it.
Right.
And that was, I think, another thing that in a way contributed to my later interest in working integratively.
Right.
Because I would go to one supervision and I'd hear one thing. And then 2 days later, I'd go to another supervisor because the fellowship enabled me to have 3 or 4 supervisors at once because it paid for that too.
Yeah.
And go to another supervisor who was saying something almost the exact
Contradictory,
opposite.
right.
And they were both people I respected. So, the challenge of how do I put together, not have to choose, but take what was useful for me.
So interesting. Yeah, I mean, when I went through, and most of my peers, there were tracks, and we took courses across tracks. That's always been encouraged.
Right.
But in a way, I think you're suggesting something kind of interesting, which is that while we'd never had to officially affiliate, the affiliation was built into the choices that you made, and you did not have that.
Right.
So that's really quite different.
Right.
Can we go back to then, now, please?
Sure.
And get rid of the tracks?
I would love that.
Yes, so would I.
Yeah. I think even as it was happening, I wasn't happy to see it happening.
Yeah.
But especially as it's evolved, I think, my whole disposition in a way is to dismantle silos.
Right.
And now, we've got silos built in, so to speak.
We do.
There are efforts to go beyond that, certainly, but
yeah, I mean, my take is that we're far less siloed than we were 20 years ago.
I think that's true.
Like the Protestants hate the Catholics and the Catholics hate the Protestants. Freudians don't hate the interpersonalists anymore, and vice versa. We really did. So that's better, But there still are these subcategories to which
Right.
people feel loyal.
Right.
So
Yeah.
tell me some more about sort of how your interest in integrating different kinds of theories
Right.
developed.
You know, it's funny. You've made a couple of comments which I think are certainly accurate about how what felt like an accident, a coincidence, really wasn't.
Yeah.
But here was another one that sort of initially, it came from a kind of accident. He had been invited to participate on a panel at APA. And it was a panel that was going to be about Walter Mischel's book, Personality and Assessment. And Mischel, it was a book that at that time really exploded on the scene. It was like the book for a couple of years. And it was a book that was a tremendous attack on psychoanalysis from a social learning, learning theory vantage and behavior therapy vantage point. And so George Klein was going to be the defender of psychoanalysis. And he decided, I don't want to bother with that. Paul, you do it. And it was sort of like, you got orders from a general. It
Right.
wasn't, Paul, maybe this would be of interest to you.
Right.
Paul, you do it. And so it wasn't something I wanted to do.
Interesting.
Then I started reading it, and I was fascinated.
Reading his book.
The Mischel book.
Yeah.
It was a kind of a very, in one sense, a very wrong-headed blunderbuss attack on psychoanalysis. And at the same time, it was a brilliant articulation of something that I had sort of been kind of unconsciously, unwittingly, whatever the word, I sort of say unconsciously, but that feels too self-conscious to say it as unconsciously. But I had been in my psychoanalytic thinking, still very early in my career. I wasn't yet finished with my training at Postdoc. I had been increasingly concerned that the ways that we framed things in psychoanalytic formulations were too internal, and that as a consequence, they not only didn't pay attention to what was going on in our lives, but they didn't pay attention to how enormously variable we could be from one context to another. And that has been, ever since then, it was kind of probably brewing, again, unconsciously, unwittingly, before, and then once I read Mischel and came to grips with it, it really became central in my thinking ever since. How variable we can be, and how much, for Mischel, who highlighted that and cited all sorts of empirical evidence for his idea was we don't have consistent traits, we vary from situation to situation.
Sort of anticipating self-state stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously not stated as such.
No.
But yeah.
But it's kind of like the anticipation of that whole notion.
Yeah.
That there is no straight line
Right.
between who we are and what we do and think and say.
But for Mischel, it was sort of like a way of dismissing anything about personality at all.
How can you analyze somebody if they're different from situation to situation?
Right, and where it's only the situation that really matters.
Right.
Ironically, Mischel is also, for people for whom that name isn't familiar, he's the marshmallow guy. The guy who later became famous for, the kids who can wait and take, instead of getting one marshmallow now, they'll get 2 marshmallows later.
Right.
And he studied how those kids, years later, they're more successful. So suddenly he was like the trait theorist that he was criticizing.
So he called that a trait.
Yeah.
As opposed to something about learning and being reinforced for
I think he would think
frustration
in
tolerance
those terms also. Yeah. But what struck me was there was a lot in Michel, and it was really also the first time that I learned anything significant, serious about behavior therapy, which was still in its early stages, but had already emerged as something that I had already learned I didn't need to pay attention to. You know, my teachers had made it clear, oh, this stuff is nonsense, don't even bother.
You mean postdoc teachers?
Postdoc and even in graduate school, you know, as it was just beginning to emerge. It was sort of like, it wasn't even something explicit, you sort of picked it up in the air.
Right.
You know, this is nonsense, don't bother with this.
Right, yeah.
And so it was a real shock to look at it and to see, A, that there was evidence that it was really helpful to people, but also that, and this was where some of the earlier things we were talking about sort of were emerging, and the direction that I took the rest of my career emerged, that they weren't as different as I mean, they were different, obviously, but not as utterly incompatible and two different universes as I had been taught. And so I began to be interested in, could they be put together? Because there were strengths there. There were things they were doing.
They meaning the
behavior
behaviors.
therapists. That analysts don't do.
Right. Still are.
And still are. Yeah. So, you know, that became a sort of a lifelong quest then. How do you put all these things together? You know, and my own identity always remained with psychoanalysis as the core. I still have no conflict describing myself as psychoanalytic in my core, but it's a core that's, you know, got open pores, so to speak.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. So how were you received at Postdoc and elsewhere? Because you were kind of a little bit of an enfant terrible doing that stuff in those years. Yeah. I mean, it was really, it was a shock in a way. I mean, it was a shock, and I anticipated it, but how much for a while, and then, you know, being kind of eventually accepted felt very good, because I had been through, you know, to hell and back, so to speak. Right.
But initially, there was this experience, you know, when I had gone through postdoc and before I, you know, strayed, so to speak, I was like a fair-haired boy. And suddenly I was the betrayer.
Right.
And I remember the first time I presented at postdoc, and I wasn't yet on the faculty. I was, I think, a graduate, but not yet on the faculty. This was my home. I was presenting ideas that I was really interested in. I was still, because I think in some way that people didn't quite understand what I was up to, I was still a good guy. So people were interested in what I had to say. There was a good turnout. Gave my talk, and literally, I don't have that great a memory, but this was seared into my memory. I remember every word, literally. The first question I was asked after I did my presentation, you know, and the audience questions was, don't you think that what you were just presenting is fascistic?
Oh my God.
That was the question.
Do you remember who did that?
I do, and I will, to protect him, I will not say.
Okay.
But I do remember.
But that's remarkable. What was supposed to be fascistic about it?
I think it was because, like, for example, to this day, I encounter many people in postdoc who now, not thinking of it as an insult, but just a description, describe me as a behaviorist. Just because, you know, once you've been tarred by this, there's nothing more. So what I think the questioner had in mind was stuff like the way that some behaviorists in institutions would, even in prisons, would use reinforcements to change people's behavior or try to change people's behavior the way the administration wanted them and so on, using reinforcement. And that wasn't what I was drawn to or what I meant, but it was sort of like this very global, if you're one of them, this must be what you stand for.
It's very naive.
Yeah.
I mean, even then, people like Festinger were doing something else. They were not doing that, even though they were in prisons and stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Well, Festinger never was a behaviorist, though.
No, I was just thinking that, in that world, there were people who were measuring behavior.
Right.
Right. And he was not looking at things from that kind of linear point of view.
Yeah. So it was not well received at first. But, so I found sort of other sources initially of sort of maintaining myself. To learn more about behavior therapy, I went to many of the people who were the leading behavior therapists of the time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me was, the psychoanalytic establishment was so stodgy and so hierarchical.
Yep.
And so, I sort of hesitate to say this from my present age, but they were
old. They were so old, right?
Gerontocratic, or whatever the word would be.
Yeah.
There was a gerontocracy.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I was in the building of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. There was a talk I was attending. And I walked into the building, and I don't know if they have since renovated it, but at that time it seemed to me that they had managed to create the longest, narrowest auditorium on the planet. Because it was laid out like this with ropes between the sections.
Red velvet rope, and you couldn't go forward.
And the training analysts, and then the faculty, and then the candidates, and then the great unwashed.
That's right. Yep, and it was the same when I went, and that was easily a decade later.
Yeah.
And we were just like, you couldn't go up front because you didn't have the right calling card.
Right. And when I encountered the behavior therapists, they were so different. First of all, many of their leading people, because it was a new idea, were young. Young people could rise easily.
Right.
They were, when I said, I'm a psychoanalyst from New York, but I've gotten interested in what behavior therapists do. I'd like to learn more about it. Can I meet with you? They were so open, and they invited me. Some of them, I got opportunities to watch their practice through a one-way screen. One of them, Arnold Lazarus, who was one of the early leading behavior therapists, invited me to actually sit in on a session. He introduced me to the patient. I'm not sure that was the
not
best
real
idea,
kosher, but okay.
It was the openness. And so I was also struck by their openness and the incredible closeness of psychoanalysis in those days, especially.
So you could have gone over to the dark side.
I could have.
You really could have.
I could have.
Yeah.
But I think the psychoanalytic core and the wish for openness has been sort of so predominant just in who I had to be in some sense that it didn't happen that way.
So instead of that, you tried to repair the breach.
Yeah. And, I certainly can think of all sorts of ways in which I can look at my family and see how now, from my present vantage point, how there were long-standing roots to wanting to do that. But it, became something somewhat autonomous in, dealing with the circumstances I had. At a certain point, when I started to meet with these behavior therapists, we got interested together in how these different points of view can fit together. And around,
So
right.
just let me interrupt you. So they were interested in how psychoanalysis fit into behavior theory?
They did, yeah.
Wow, okay, I did not know that.
Some of them said to me, and it's a sort of, I'm embarrassed to say it here because it sounds like blowing my own horn. And
It's
I think
okay,
it was
you're
more,
allowed to.
I think it was more they just didn't know other analysts and they
Yeah.
saw them through a stereotypic lens. But they said, you're the one analyst that we can listen to, and maybe you can help us see more about where it fits.
So, I don't think that they were wrong, because I actually think you were the only guy who was doing that.
I was probably one of the very few who was doing it,
Yeah.
but they were overestimating me in many ways.
He doth protest too much.
Right. I'll defer.
Okay.
But we did start to have this interest in dialogue, and then around that time, my wife, she had first gone to law school. She practiced law for a couple of years, but she saw I was happier with my switch, and she decided to switch.
Right.
And so she went to NYU, got her PhD in clinical, and then instead of going into analytic training, she went to Ackerman for family therapy training. And she was going through Ackerman around the time that I was working on my first book, Psychoanalysis and Behavior Therapy. And in that book, I kind of was emphasizing what I've eventually called cyclical psychodynamics, which was a kind of circular causation and vicious circles and so on. And she said, that's a lot of what I'm learning
And
at
family
Ackerman.
systems stuff.
And
yeah.
so we she and I got very interested in that intersection, and we wrote a book together. The only thing we've written together, because we have very different writing styles. Ellen is very organized, and she would have an outline, and she would really follow it clearly. And I would
just
sort
write.
of wander this way and that.
Right.
And she said, she liked the product, but it drove her crazy how I got there. And she would try to organize me,
Yeah.
and
Doesn't work real well.
I couldn't be organized.
Right. Yeah.
We actually, the only way we could actually talk about the book was once a week we'd go out on a date and talk about it over wine. That was the way we really wrote the book together. But it was mostly her book.
Right. So if you, I hope I'm not jumping over something. Did you have more that you want to say about that part?
The relevance of that part is that was going on then as I'm working on the interface of psychoanalysis and behavior therapy. And now there's a third interface of family therapy. And so it really begins to be not just about a kind of a binary, but how do we break out of the silos? And I started meeting with a number of people of different vantage points, and we eventually created an organization that was called the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. And that became, it's an organization that still exists, and it's actually an international organization now. And that became, in terms of what your earlier question of where was my sort of support group, these were all people who were people who didn't fully fit in wherever they were initially trained. We were all sort of misfits together in some way, and misfits especially because we were interested in listening to each other.
Right. So here we are now, it's 2026. If you look back on what you started to do and then what you did do over the course of decades, what do you think now about the relative success and impact of your attempt to move us away from silos and toward integration?
That's a really interesting question, and as I'm sure you won't be surprised, it's one I think about a lot.
Yeah.
And it depends on my mood on any given day. You know, I mean, I see a lot of evidence of it having a lot of impact.
Yeah.
And people write to me and people, you know, let me know how important what I've done has been to them. And at the same time, I look out and I still see silos.
Yeah. Well, they're getting worse, right, in the political realm anyway.
Yeah. And I think the other dimension of integration that, apropos what you're talking about in the political context now, you know, I also had been really interested in, and still am, in integrating our thinking about clinical matters, and you know, you're mentioning, you know, social psychology and clinical psychology. That's an aspiration I still have in some way, and
To integrate them how?
well, I've made a couple of efforts. The first one was a book that I wrote back in 1983 called The Poverty of Affluence.
Right.
That was a kind of effort to try to use psychological understanding to understand how the foundations of our society, the foundations of the materialistic and growth-centered ideas that are still so dominant, how they are contradicted by any understanding of what the real foundations of human satisfaction are.
Meaning it's not all about money?
It seems to be not. There's a lot of research, actually, even that shows the number probably has changed because of inflation, but I remember a number of years back, it was somewhere around $75,000 a year. That, you know, being poor does feel lousy. That's real. That's true.
Course.
And when people are poor and want more, that makes total sense.
Right.
But there comes a point that
You've got enough.
upper middle class people cross without noticing, where that isn't doing it anymore.
Right.
And then what happens is, and here was another place where vicious circles came in,
Right.
where, like, for example, when people feel, you know, they're in jobs that they don't really like because it's the way to have more stuff,
Right.
and pays well and so on. And then they're not feeling so good about it, and then they feel, I need a bigger house. So they move far away, they have a long commute, they don't see their families as much. It makes them even more miserable.
Right.
What do you do within the rules of our society when you're more miserable? You've got to
Make
have
more
even
money.
more.
Right.
So you work even harder.
Right.
And you have less time for family or friends or leisure. And it just keeps feeding on
Right.
itself.
Right.
So it's a similar kind of vicious circle that our society is caught in.
Yeah.
And I think that dynamic is still actually, it's not the only source, but it's still a big source of the crazy divisions and crazy phenomena that we have in our society today.
Right.
You know, that there are people who really need stuff, and most of the people who think they need stuff
Don't need stuff. And then there's the president. But we won't even go
we
there.
won't even go there.
Do you think that postdoc, I mean, you certainly have a notable presence there. Do you think that candidates have kind of integrated your perspective? I mean, obviously that's too broad a statement, but still.
I think maybe not. And the reason I say that is twofold. One is that postdoc is, by its very nature, devoted to one point of view, as it should be. It's what it's about. But I haven't taught my course for quite a few years at postdoc. And I think because there isn't as much interest in it as there is elsewhere.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah, well, from my self-serving point of view, I would agree. But,
Give a colloquium.
yeah. I mean, I had an experience relatively recently where, within just a few months, I was giving seminars online for Ukraine, for Kazakhstan, for all sorts of places
right?
around the world.
Yeah.
And then feeling like the place where I trained, there isn't the same kind
They're
of interest.
not interested,
you know?
Yeah, it's really too damn bad. Do it in China. You'll have a whole new cohort.
Right, yeah.
How do you see psychoanalytic thinking, which itself is extremely variegated, as we know, and different kinds of behavioral family systems, and I will stick in there group therapy as well. I don't know whether you've been involved with that or not, actually. But how do you see those different orientations colliding and coordinating?
Well, I think what I've been increasingly interested in, and the topic I'm sort of working on these days, is one that I'm framing for myself in terms of what I'm calling living in the world. That what we need to understand and work with is not just the subjective, the internal, the intrapsychic. And I say not just because that is important.
Sure.
And if you ignore it, you're losing the heart of everything.
Right.
But everything my conviction and the way that I have departed in some way even from a lot of people whose views are similar to mine within the psychoanalytic world, is that my conviction is that there is virtually nothing that is purely intrapsychic, in the sense that so sealed off from everyday experience that it just generates itself. That my conviction is that deeply unconscious inclinations, perceptions, interpretations, desires, and so on shape our experiences in the world.
And vice versa.
And vice versa,
Right.
Exactly.
So there's interpenetration, and people disagree with that?
Well, when I read a lot of, say, object relations writing.
From the 30s and the 40s, you mean, or you mean now?
I mean, even now. I can't cite a specific thing I've read, but recently. But my experience is that, for example, one kind of indicator for me is that words like pre-Oedipal or primitive or archaic still appear in our literature with great regularity. And they often, if we think of them, particularly words like primitive or archaic, as just descriptive terms of, the person isn't thinking so well these days, isn't thinking so well, period.
Right.
That, then it wouldn't have that connotation. But most of what I read still implies that there is inside that archaic core that is, sort of the independent variable, so to speak.
So it's like internalized object relations that are not responsive to input from the outside.
Right. And I think what makes it hard to fully articulate it, and I think you're asking a question that's, to my mind, almost at the cutting edge of how to further articulate theory. Because I understand what you mean when you say, wouldn't every analytic thinker agree? And in principle, phrased certain ways, they would.
Right.
And yet, at the same time, there's something that still really like, there is an assumption of a core that is from early childhood that is not really about how our daily life is keeping it that way.
Right. So like I was going to start to argue with you and say, okay, well that's Winnicott's true self, sure. But once we get to self-state theory and, moving states, we're talking about something that shifts in the present. But I also think that, and you tell me if you agree or not, that most people who use that language still see those self-states as deeply embedded in early history.
Exactly. That's exactly how I see it, at least. Yeah, that they are dissociated self-states, but much less often do you see descriptions of how different circumstances in which we are embedded or participating evoke different self-states. It's almost like, a quantum mechanics description where something just spontaneously changes state.
It's almost as if going the other way takes you in the direction of social psychology.
Yeah.
How the social environment affects us.
Social psychology and, Skinnerian behaviorism.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I remember there's a passage in Greenberg and Mitchell's classic book, Object Relations and Psychoanalysis, where they talk about social, the assumption that has been central in psychoanalysis, that the social is inherently superficial, and it's the veneer, but below that is sort of the real stuff.
Right.
And I think in some way that still is a dominant idea.
Yeah, I mean, from my chair, the more classical the theory, the more dominant. When you start looking at relational theory, self-psychology, interpersonal theory, you see more attention to the impact of the immediate environment than if everything is located in unconscious conflicts that go back to pre-Oedipal.
Yeah, and I think, there are clearly, not only are there variations, but in a way it's almost like the theorists in our field have somewhat different self-states.
For sure.
There are moments when, and I think that's part of what you're alluding to, for most of the people that we would most respect, they would say, of course, we are always in a constant back and forth with the relationships around us, the circumstances around us. And then there's a kind of another self-state where that's not taken into account.
Right, and that's whatever you want to call it. That's the core self, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. And I've been thinking about this, for example, even, because I know you're especially interested in Winnicott, and Winnicott is wonderful in so many ways. But when I think of the concept of the false self, for example, and this partly comes from my having, relatively recently been just very interested in this idea of making room for the disavowed parts of the self, and that the idea of a false self implies in a way that this is who you really are,
and
this isn't.
And
I would rather think of it as what Winnicott calls the false self, and I think obviously he's onto something important, but it's the less known self. It's the less accepted self. But
he would not agree with you.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Because to refer to that as the true self implies that everything I thought I knew about myself is false. And I don't agree with that. I think that's another part of us. It can be fragile because we have a part of ourselves that leaves out an important part of who we are. But I don't think it's that it leaves out who we really are.
Right, right.
I think who we really are is, in a sense, both.
Right.
You know.
I would love to have a long argument with you about that, because I think that the false self, if you take a look at his continuum, it's only in illness that we're really looking at something that is that inaccessible. But you know, the very fact that we're being so polite with each other is not disconnected from who we actually are. So, but I'm going to not do that because I have my eye on the clock.
And I'm thinking this is the perfect way to wrap up, because it ends with, let's get together and have another conversation.
Absolutely.
And it won't be taped, but we'll enjoy it.
That's better, yeah. But before we get there, is there anything that you would want to sort of leave the folks who are going to be listening to this from the program with? Like, if you could tell candidates in training sort of like what your wisdom has to offer them, what would you say?
I think maybe the one thing I would want to add is that one of the most important developments in the psychoanalytic world in recent years, but one of, again, the potentially siloing elements, is the increasing, apropos what we've been talking about, the increasing attention to the larger social context, to issues of race and class and poverty and inequality and all of that. And it's wonderful that psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts are paying more attention to that. But I think it's really important not to think of that as something separate from, you know, what psychoanalysis has been about, or as just really describable in terms of, you know, it's easy, for example, to attribute, let's say, racism to primitive object relations, you know, in some way, to almost dismiss it, put it down by describing it as infantile and primitive and so on. And I think that's sort of that's the sort of easy takedown. It's a kind of a more mechanical use of psychoanalytic ideas. And I would like to, in a way, I think people like Erickson and Fromm, you know, and Horney in certain ways, you know, we're trying to do a more two-way description.
I think that's
you
right.
know, where it isn't just dismissing it, but showing how living in a world that's constructed in certain ways and has real consequences of various sorts shapes the inner life, again, just as the inner life shapes the other. And so I would want to sort of, my message, so to speak, to candidates or others in our field would be, yes, please hold on to this preciously newfound or rediscovered, because it was there earlier, obviously, attention to social injustices, the social context, the way the economy, the way politics affect us, but don't treat that as some separate realm from the inner world. Look at how they shape each other in a continuing way.
I completely agree. I thought you were going to say something entirely different.
I'm curious.
I thought that you were going to say something about how we need to not allow our politics to fragment us, because there's another way in which the current moment, the present moment, is countering pulls toward integration. At least that's how I see it.
I think that's really crucial. And, you know, until the current era, which
please God, let it be in January.
Is so horrifying. I had felt that even when politicians, you know, speak to the worst side of us and can get people to follow them with this worst side of us, it is because we all have more than one side. And that the aim isn't that, like, I find it myself hard to resist the temptation to dismiss people whose politics is radically different from mine. And in some way, I don't think we'll ever heal unless we find some way to
find the
go
other,
beyond that.
the human in the other.
Yeah.
And that's outside psychoanalysis, but it's also inside psychoanalysis, where it's a bit worrisome.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Paul, this has been delightful. I wish we could keep going because I have so many things I want to ask you.
Well, I enjoyed it a lot, and although whoever is watching this video won't be privy to what comes next, I'm excited to continue the conversation.
Thank you, and really thank you for all of this and for the real gift that you've given Postdoc, which is to sort of expand us beyond our silos, as you put it.
Thank you.
Thank you.